Hello, and welcome to the National Park Service and the Federal Aviation Administration public meeting for the draft air tour management plan for Glacier National Park. My name is Michelle Carter. I'm an environmental protection specialist with the National Park Service, and I'll be your moderator for this afternoon. I'd like to start off by defining a couple of acronyms you'll hear us use throughout the meeting. You'll hear us refer to the National Park Service as the NPS, the Federal Aviation Administration as the FAA, and the Air Tour Management Plans as ATMPs. We'll define the remaining acronyms as we go along. Next slide, please. We're holding this virtual public meeting to review the draft ATMP for Glacier and to seek public feedback on the draft. This meeting is being held pursuant to the National Parks Air Tour Management Act of 2000, also known as NEPATMA, and its implementing regulations. You'll hear a little bit more about NEPATMA and the draft ATMP shortly, along with information on how you can submit questions and official comments. But before we dive into the presentations, I'd like to take a minute and introduce our presenters and provide a little bit more information about meeting logistics and how you can participate. Next slide. Joining us this evening as presenters are Keith Lusk, Program Manager and Special Program Staff with the Western Pacific region of FAA. From the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division of the National Park Service, we have Adam Biko. He's a Program Manager for Policy, Planning, and Compliance. And from Glacier National Park, we have the Acting Park Superintendent, Pete Webster. Keith and Adam are going to give us a brief overview of NEPATMA and the purpose of today's meeting. We'll then hear from Superintendent Webster, who'll share a little bit more information from the park's perspective and discuss park-specific resources in the context of the ATMP. Next slide. So throughout the meeting, we invite you to submit questions, which will be addressed after all of the presentations as part of the Q&A session. The questions submitted through today's meeting will be considered by the agencies as they continue drafting the ATMP, but they won't be what we consider formal comments. Next slide. All official formal comments must be submitted through the National Park Service Planning, Environment, and Public Comment site, or PEPC as we call it, or sent to the mailing addresses listed on the park's PEPC site. Only comments received through one of these two avenues will become part of the official record. The agencies are not accepting comments via email. We'll share a little bit more information about this later in the presentation. It's also important to note that the formal comments must be submitted on or before October 3rd of this year. Next slide, please. This meeting is being live streamed across Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you're watching on one of these platforms, you can submit your questions using the link to a Google form that FAA will post into the chat area of the platform that you're using. When the time comes, we'll read your question aloud and our presenters will respond. We're going to do our best to get to all of the questions, but in the event that we don't get to your question, we'll provide contact information at the end where you can go for a post-meeting follow-up. We're planning for this meeting to be 90 minutes long, and we'll adjourn at 5 p.m. Pacific time. If we get through all of the questions early, we'll keep the meeting active until 5, until additional questions come in. And please note this meeting is being recorded. We appreciate you joining us this evening to learn more about Glacier's draft ATMP. We're now going to play a short video before I turn it over to Keith and Adam to provide additional details about NEPATMA and why we're here today.
The United States is home to some of the most breathtaking national parks and tribal lands in the world. It is important that we protect these lands while ensuring that the public has ample opportunity to enjoy these national treasures. Air tours offer the public a totally different type of experience. The Federal Aviation Administration and the National Park Service work together to manage air tours over national parks. We are developing plans that help protect wildlife, wilderness character, cultural resources, natural soundscapes, and visitor enjoyment. These plans are known as Air Tour Management Plans, and today we will explore the specifics of the draft plan for your park. As part of our planning process, we consult with tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, state and tribal historic preservation officers, and wildlife biologists. We assess noise, wildlife protection, and other environmental considerations, and we will continue to make adjustments to these plans as needed. And we consider the appropriate level of National Environmental Policy Act review for these plans. The FAA and the National Park Service are committed to ensuring safe flights at our national parks while safeguarding park resources. Following today's presentation, we encourage you to review your park's draft Air Tour Management Plan and provide official comments through the National Park Service Planning, Environment, and Public Comment website. Together, we can celebrate these special places and ensure they can be enjoyed for generations to come.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keith Lusk, and I'm a program manager with the Federal Aviation Administration, and I'm here with my National Park Service colleague, Adam Biko, and we're going to provide you with a little background information about the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, as well as air tour management plans in general. Next slide, please. So the National Parks Air Tour Management Act was enacted in April of 2000 with subsequent amendment provisions provided for in 2012. And basically at a high level, what the act requires is that the FAA, in cooperation with the Park Service, needs to develop air tour management plans, or ATMPs, at those parks and tribal lands where air tour operators have applied to conduct commercial air tours. It's important to note what an air tour management plan applies to and what it does not apply to. The Act is strictly focused on commercial air tour operations over national park units. So over the national park boundary or within a half-mile buffer park boundary. Also over tribal lands that are either within the park or adjacent or abutting to the park. And in terms of the airspace that these air tour operations are transiting when they're going over the park or within the half-mile buffer, we're looking basically at the airspace from ground level to 5,000 feet above ground level. When the FAA made the final rule for Part 136, which covers these types of air tour operations, that was the definition of an air tour, was between 0 and 5,000 feet AGL. That's where obviously the majority of air tours do occur over national park units. Next slide, please. Okay, as mentioned, this is strictly focused on commercial air tour operations. So just to be clear and not create any confusion with the public out there, or anyone else that is new to this arena, we're not looking at any requirements for general aviation type activities, commercial airlines, or military flights. The Act also does not apply to any parks in Alaska. When the original legislation came out in 2000, the national park units in the state of Alaska were specifically exempted from this Act. Also, the Grand Canyon National Park, the National Parks Air Tour Management Act does not apply to Grand Canyon National Park. There's a lot of commercial air tour activity at that park, but it is covered under separate legislation. Basically, it's covered under the Overflights Act of 1987. Also, the original legislation in 2000 specifically prohibited commercial air tours over Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. As I mentioned previously, in 2012, there was some amendment provisions to the original legislation. One of the primary amendment provisions was the institution or implementation of exempt park list. And basically these are for low activity parks with 50 or fewer annual air tour operations. The amendment provision allows the FAA and the Park Service not to have to do an air tour management plan or a voluntary agreement for that park if it's again at 50 or fewer annual air tours. There is a provision in the Act that the Park Service can withdraw that exemption should they feel the need to protect park resources or visitor experience or tribal lands. Glacier National Park is not on the exempt park list. The tour activity at that park is above 50 air tour operations annually based on recent reporting activity. As I mentioned, abutting tribal lands that may be overflown or are overflown in the conduct of a commercial air tour over the park, the agencies need to invite that tribe to be a cooperating agencies for compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. We'll talk a little bit more about the environmental compliance aspects of this program in some later slides. Next slide, please. The legislation makes a distinction between operators. There's basically two different classes of operators, if you will. Let me back up a bit. Commercial air tour operators needed to apply to the FAA for what is called operating authority in order to operate over national park units or abutting tribal lands. Most of the air tour operators did so shortly after the 2000 legislation came into effect. And the two different types of commercial air tour operators are what are called existing air tour operators and new entrant operators. Existing air tour operators are those operators who had been flying in the years running up to enactment of the Act. So they have been flying over Glacier National Park, in this case, in the years prior to the year 2000 when the Act came into effect. They were granted what was called interim operating authority by the Federal Aviation Administration. And this was based on what the operators reported to the FAA in terms of the number of tours that they had completed or conducted in the year prior to enactment of the Act, which would have been 1999, or in the 3 years, a 3-year average of 1997 through 1999. So the interim operating authority that the FAA provided to these air tour operators is kind of a not to exceed annual limit. It allows those operators to continue to operate at the park. So they've been continuing to be able to conduct tours at those parks until such time as the agencies would complete an air tour management plan to more effectively manage those tours. Obviously, now we're in the process of drafting a plan for Glacier National Park. At the time that we go final with the air tour management plan for Glacier, that interim operating authority will go away and operating authority will come into effect. And the number of tours allocated under that plan could be different than what was originally granted through interim operating authority. So that really covers existing commercial air tour operators. All the operators at Glacier National Park were considered existing air tour operators. So they were flying and conducting tours basically for the past few decades. We're not introducing new operators or new tour activity at this park. This has been ongoing operations that have been going on at this park for quite some time. The air tour management plan will just allow the agencies to more effectively manage those tours and hopefully reduce adverse impacts, if any, associated with those tours. So the new entrant commercial air tour operators, as you probably figure out, are those operators that apply to the FAA for operating authority at a park after enactment of the Act. So after April of 2000, we have no new entrant applications at Glacier National Park. Next slide, please. I think I'm passing it over to Adam.
Thanks, Keith. Again, my name is Adam Biko, and I'm with the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division of the National Park Service, based in Colorado. Just want to take a moment to thank everyone who was able to join us tonight and reiterate that we welcome your questions and comments. So NEPATMA, the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, defines the objective of an ATMP to develop acceptable and effective measures to mitigate or prevent the significant adverse impacts, if any, resulting from commercial air tour operations upon natural and cultural resources, visitor experiences, and tribal lands. Next slide, please. So what can be included in an ATMP? Well, NEPATMA states that an ATMP may prohibit commercial air tours, operations in part or in whole, may establish conditions for the conduct of air tour operations, including routes, altitudes, time of day restrictions, restrictions for particular events, maximum number of flights, etc. An ATMP must apply to all air tour commercial operations within 1/2 mile outside the boundary of the national park. An ATMP must also include an incentive for the adoption of quiet aircraft technology. An ATMP must also provide for the allocation of opportunities to conduct air tours when the ATMP limits the number of operations. And an ATMP must justify and document the need for any measures taken pursuant to the items above and include such justification in the record of decision. Next slide, please. So Glacier is not the only park going through an air tour planning process. The FAA and the Park Service are working on ATMPs for 24 parks concurrently right now. As you can see from this map, air tour management planning processes are occurring across the nation, from Florida to the state of Washington to Hawaii. Glacier is the only National Park Service unit in the Northern Rockies that's currently going through an ATMP. Next slide, please. So as part of this planning process and in compliance with the National Park Air Tour Management Act, for each ATMP, the agencies will publish proposed ATMPs in the Federal Register, which we have done for Glacier National Park, hold at least one public meeting, which is what we're doing here tonight, holding a public meeting to get your comments and questions. Must also comply with the National Environmental Policy Act and other legal requirements, which include the National Historic Preservation Act and the Endangered Species Act, and invite tribes to participate as cooperating agencies for NEPA compliance in the case where tribes are or may be overflown. So the primary purpose for today's meeting is to review the components of the draft ATMP for Glacier National Park. With that, Michelle, I'll pass it back to you.
Great, thank you, Adam and Keith. And now we'll hear from Superintendent Webster with more perspective from the park's perspective in the context of the draft ATMP.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Adam and Keith as well for your overviews. And good afternoon, evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I want to start by welcoming you, all of you from the community and our stakeholders here at the park. I am Pete Webster. I'm the Deputy Superintendent at Glacier National Park, and since the beginning of this summer has been serving as the Acting Superintendent for Glacier. Certainly the main purpose of today is to hear from you and respond to any questions you have on the air tour management plan for Glacier National Park. Your input's very important to us, and I'm looking forward to hearing from each of you today. Next slide, please. Glacier National Park is over 1 million acres in northern Montana. We're bordered to the north by Waterton Lakes National Park in Canada. Glacier has been set aside as a scenic park, aptly named given its spectacular glacially carved landscape. The park preserves wilderness, wildlife, natural processes, and historic and cultural heritage for our nation. We're at the heart of the crown of the continent here. Glacier is designated as an international biosphere reserve, and along with Waterton Lakes National Park, we were set aside as the world's first international peace park, World Heritage Site, And now we are the world's first transboundary dark sky park as well, excuse me. Next slide, please. All right, so I want to take a moment and point out a few features on the park map here to help folks get oriented. Some of you may be on a phone or have small devices, so if you can't see the screen, I'll describe it a little bit briefly here as well. What we're just seeing here is a map of Glacier National Park and Waterton Lakes National Park to the north of us across the Canadian border. The map also shows our 3 visitor centers, Apgar on the western side, St. Mary on the eastern side, and Logan Pass in the middle of the park, along with Going to the Sun Road that connects all 3 going through the heart of the park. To the east is the Blackfeet Reservation. I certainly want to point out that the air tours will not be flying over the Blackfeet Indian Reservation over tribal lands as well. All right, next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to briefly discuss some of the resources that are being considered as under the ATMP process. Before I do that, I do want to acknowledge the long human history of the area that we now call Glacier National Park. Native American tribes have used these lands for centuries, specifically the Blackfeet Indians to the east of us and Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes to the west and south of us. Both have strong traditional cultural connections to the lands that are now the park, as well as there are a number of other affiliated tribes. The park contains a number of significant natural and cultural resources. Cultural resources certainly include archaeological sites, historic buildings, and our sensitive cultural sites for Native Americans. We have a number of historic districts, historic landmarks, national historic landmarks, national register sites within the park. To name some, Going to the Sun Road, Lake McDonald Lodge, Many Glacier Hotel, and certainly countless other cultural sites to Native Americans. Next slide, please. All right, as we're going to speak to existing air tour conditions here at the park, as Keith alluded to, air tours have been operating over Glacier since at least the 1980s. They were certainly prevalent in the 1990s as well. During that time in the 90s, the late 90s, the park was developing our general management plan, pretty much coinciding along with the creation of the NEPATMA legislation as well. Impacts for air tours were such an issue at that time, even then, that it was specifically called out in our general management plan. Our general management plan recalled the characteristics of tranquility and peace that were in the congressional designation for our International Peace Park with Waterton. It also spoke to solitude and tranquility in our wilderness recommendation to Congress as well. As such, the GMP directed the park to work with FAA on a process to ultimately phase out existing commercial air tours over Glacier National Park. Managing for wilderness values and natural soundscapes, among all of our other resources, has remained a key management objective since then as well. Coming into 2021, there were 5 commercial air tour operators with authorization to conduct operations over the park. 3 of those air tour operators, Homestead Helicopters, Minuteman Aviation, Red Eagle Aviation, also doing business as Montana Air Adventures, they currently are conducting air tours over Glacier National Park. These operators hold the Interim Operating Authority, or IOA, currently for a combined total of 891 flights at the park for each year. 2 additional operators, Montana by Air and Kruger Helicopter Services, previously held IOA over the park and conducted air tours over the last several years. These operators, though, this year have surrendered their operating certificates, and with that, their IOA this year. let's see here. Again, as I said, the annual number of commercial air tours over the park has been limited by the interim operating authority authorizations. And there have been no designated parameters on route, time of day, altitude restrictions set aside that allowed the park and FAA to manage air tours over the park. The provisions and conditions in the proposed ATMP here address these parameters in a manner designed to protect park resources and visitor experience from the effects of commercial air tour operations and to support the park management objectives. Next slide. All right, I'll try to walk you through this table a little bit here. Looking at the number of air tour authorized per year, again, currently that's set for the 3 operators currently with authority at 891. Looking at the 3-year average of 2017 through 2019 for those 3 operators, they flew an average of 144 flights per year. And so our draft ATMP is calling to set the allocations moving forward at that 144 annually between the 3 operators. The current conditions, as we said before, there are no restrictions set by the Park Service over the park. The reported altitudes from the operators have ranged, for their flight paths, have ranged from 7,500 feet to 10,500 feet means above mean sea level, which is an altitude, obviously. The draft plan calls for flying no lower than 2,600 feet, which is essentially half a mile above ground level. This is also a latitude, or I'm sorry, a lateral distance as well. I do want to acknowledge that the 2,600 feet above ground level is actually going to be, in most cases, if not all cases, higher than what the reported altitudes are. So the air tour plan as written currently would propose that the altitudes will be higher than they're currently flown. Under existing conditions, there are no restrictions to aircraft type. Moving forward, it's certainly the aircraft that the companies are flying currently. Previously and currently, there are no restrictions as to when operators fly. Moving forward with our draft ATMP plan, operators would be only allowed to fly 1 hour after sunrise until 1 hour before sunset. There is a quiet technology incentive built into the plan that allows operators, should they choose to use this technology, would allow them to fly from sunrise to sunset. There are no restrictions as to the day of the week, and moving forward, that would be the case. What would be added to the plan is allowing the NPS to establish temporary no-fly periods for any special events that may be happening in the park, on the ground, or for other planned management activities. And then lastly, required reporting and any additional requirements. Currently, operators report semi-annually to both the FAA and the National Park Service the number of flights that they're flying. That would continue on with our draft ATMP. In addition to that, we would call for an annual meeting between the Park Service, Glacier National Park, the FAA, and the operators. There are restrictions in place for operators to avoid wildlife once they become visible from the air. There are daily air tour limitations capped at 3 per day, something that we don't have currently. Annual allocations, again, will be adjusted under the new air tour management plan. Hovering will become prohibited under the plan. And there is provisions for in-flight communication technology to allow some situational awareness with other aircraft in the area. Okay, next slide, please. All right, again, we're looking at a map here. And again, for those on phones or other small devices, let me take a moment to describe what we're looking at here. This is again, a map of the park. It shows 2 flight paths, one in yellow, which is the flight path reported by Red Eagle Aviation. It goes departs from Kalispell and flies directly towards the park, flies up the Harrison Lake drainage, up over the Jackson, Blackfoot, Pompelli Glacier complex area, back around Logan Pass, goes up along the garden wall, and seems to circle the Iceberg Lake area, and then making a direct path back down the Lake McDonald Valley back to Kalispell. And then the other route in green is the route reported by Minuteman Aviation, and it departs from West Glacier area, again, flies up the Harrison Lake drainage area, flies up and around Logan Pass, circles back down over Sperry Chalet area, and then back to Lake McDonald into West Glacier again. We'll say that the green route originally, or as flown previously, went all the way up to the Canadian border. However, under our air tour management plan draft, we looked at reducing that route to protect portions of the park that are considered core habitat for grizzly bear, as well as for wilderness values and visitor experience opportunities. With that, I'll say next slide. All right. So under the draft under the draft air tour management plan again, the number of commercial air tours authorized will be set at that 144 for the 3 operators. Should one of those operators close their business, sells their business, or otherwise ceases to operate, the number of air tours will be reduced by the number allocated to that operator. The operating authority under the air tour plan may not be assumed by a successor purchaser or otherwise transferred in any circumstances. And as Keith had alluded to as well, FAA and the Park Service will not consider applications from new entrants going forward. And as I said already, no operator may conduct more than 3 commercial air tours per day. All right, next slide. All right, as we get into the justifications for some of the measures we're taking, these provisions and conditions are designed to protect park resources and visitor experience from the effects that commercial air tours bring and support our management objectives for the park as I described. The preservation of natural sounds and the protection of cultural and natural resources, wilderness character, and preserving visitor experience are a priority for the National Park Service and Glacier National Park. The commercial air tour routes authorized under the draft ATMP and the conditions that require lateral and altitude adjustments are intended to protect portions of the park that are considered core habitat, as I said, for the grizzly bear, as well as for wilderness values and visitor experience. Therefore, the commercial air tour routes included in this ATMP have been concentrated over or near going to the Sun Road corridor in particular as much as possible to help avoid these impacts across the whole park. The condition that commercial air tours may fly no lower than 2,600 feet above ground level under the plan is intended to protect bald eagles and other raptors as well from the impacts of air tours. And additionally, the provision will improve preservation of wilderness character and visitor experiences again on the ground, including our interpretive programming by reducing the intensity of air tour noise to visitors on the ground. The condition that air tours may not hover in place, circle, or otherwise need to avoid wildlife are intended to prevent disturbances to noise-sensitive wildlife species, including ungulates, birds, and again, other federally listed species such as Canada lynx, in addition to the grizzly bear. Sunset and sunrise are important times for wildlife and visitor experience. Biologically important behaviors for many species happen during this time, such as dawn chorus for songbirds and foraging and predation for other species. Time and day restrictions have been included to protect these resources. And then lastly, the restrictions for particular events are intended to prevent noise interruptions of park events and tribal practices going forward. And next slide, please. Very much. The annual and daily flight limits of this ATMP are designed to protect park resources and visitor experience from the effects of air tours, as I've said. The preservation of natural sounds, protection of natural and cultural resources, wilderness character, and preserving visitor experience by addressing noise issues are a priority of Glacier National Park. Working with the FAA to phase out commercial air tours through attrition in this ATMP is in line with the park's 1999 general management plan, as well as all of our subsequent planning efforts. And as an interim step, this plan has several measures taken to protect noise-sensitive resources, as well as improving visitor experience in the park. And lastly, the opportunity to hold annual meetings between the Park Service, Glacier National Park, and the FAA with our operators will ensure effectiveness of implementing this ATMP. That will conclude my portion. I'll turn it back to you, Keith.
Great. Thank you very much, Superintendent Webster. Really appreciate your detailed briefing on the specifics of that draft plan for Glacier. Circling back to a previous point I had made on an earlier slide about the agencies requiring compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. The development of this is considered a federal action, and it is subject to NEPA compliance. NEPA does require that the agencies consider the effect of this action, which is the development of the air tour management plan, on the human and natural environment. So basically what we're looking at is the commercial air tour effects on the human and natural environment. Most of the impacts, directly associated potentially with noise effects or visual effects, or those types of things that we're looking at. We need to determine the appropriate level of environmental review. There's various levels of environmental review in terms of the documentation. There's what are called categorically excluded actions. There's document preparations that would include analysis as part of an environmental assessment. And then at the more complex and major federal action, the environmental impact statement. At this time, the agencies are considering developing this ATMP under a National Park Service categorical exclusion. And I want to be clear that when we say it's a categorical exclusion, that is part of the NEPA review, part of the NEPA process. We're not bypassing or skipping NEPA. Categorical exclusion is something that is provided for under the statutes. Agencies will consider public comments on the air tour management plan. Comments we received during the 30-day review period that we're now in the midst of. We're also going to consider, obviously, the information we obtained during various consultations as part of Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, or Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. And we're going to fully assess the environmental impacts before making a final decision on that appropriate level of environmental review. There's a couple of special purpose laws that the agencies also need to comply with, and I just mentioned those. Those are Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act and Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. If you could go to the next slide, please. So the agencies are currently working to complete Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act as part of the development of this draft air tour management plan. Section 106 includes the requirement that the agencies go through a number of steps in consultation and outreach with consulting parties or tribes. First and foremost is to find the undertaking and identify the participants. That's something that we have already done. Determine the area of potential effects. And basically that's the geographic area within which the agencies think, the potential impacts would occur. And that is something that we seek input and guidance from those consulting parties, tribes, or state historic preservation office. So in addition to determining the area of potential effects, we also identify the historic properties contained within that area of potential effects. Then we would assess effects to the historic properties, and then kind of as a final step, we would resolve adverse effects, if any, to historic properties. And that
Well, it looks like you may have had a little snafu with Keith's video here. So I think that we were pretty close to being to the end of his slide. Adam, I just saw your video come on. Was there anything else you wanted to add related to his 106 slide?
Yeah, I was just going to finish off his slides for him.
Thank you.
Yeah, just give me a moment though. So as Keith was mentioning on this final bullet, that the FAA and NPS have initiated consultation with the relevant SHPOs, State Historic Preservation officers, and tribes and consulting parties. And we will continue to conduct that Section 106 process. And so if any tribes are on the phone tonight, we welcome you and we encourage you to comment and ask questions in this public process, but also just want you to be aware that the Section 106 process also offers you an opportunity. Next slide, please. So the FAA, so we also have to, in this planning process, we also have to comply with Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. The FAA and the NPS are complying with Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act in the development of this draft ATMP. Section 7 includes the requirements that agencies must ensure their actions do not jeopardize the existence of any species listed under ESA or result in the destruction or adverse modifications of designated critical habitat. So the FAA and the NPS have completed a preliminary assessment for Glacier National Park and do not anticipate impacts to listed species or designated critical habitat. And we are consulting with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to ensure that this is the case. Next slide, please.
And Adam, I actually have it from here. So thank you so much for coming on. It's funny when we have these technical difficulties, and we appreciate you coming on the fly to help out. So thank you. Okay, so as we noted earlier, we're currently inviting public comment, and we're asking for comments from the public, from the tribes, from other agencies, and all interested parties on the draft. And a reminder that comments should be received on or before October 3rd of this year. I mentioned earlier also that comments can be submitted one of two ways, either through the National Park Service public comment website, and you'll see the link here on the screen that's being displayed. And you can also submit them via hard copy mail to the mailing address also listed here. And we'll drop this information into the chat later. The agencies won't be accepting comments via email. I also wanted to let you know that there is a FAQ document that's posted next to the draft ATMP on the Parks Pepsi page. There's a lot of really good information in there. And actually, if FAA has not already dropped the link to the Pepsi page, if you could do so now, that would be appreciated. Okay, so following, let's see, I'm sorry, I just got a little bit distracted. If you could go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Thanks, Kate. So following the end of the public comment period, FAA and NPS will review all of the comments that come in, and we'll use them to inform the final ATMP. We'll also continue to coordinate and complete the tribal Section 106 and Section 7 consultations. And the NEPA process then will be concluded by signing a decision document. Once all of this is wrapped up, the ATMP will be considered complete and it will be available on both the FAA and the National Park Service websites. FAA will also then follow up by updating the operation specifications for each air tour operator. Next slide, please. Okay. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to all of the presenters, and we'll go ahead and turn over now to the Q&A portion of the meeting. For anybody that may have joined late, my name is Michelle Carter. I'm an environmental protection specialist with the National Park Service, and I'm serving as the moderator of the meeting this afternoon. If you have a question that you'd like to submit, you can post it into the Google form using the link that the FAA has shared in the little chat area of the social media platform that you're using. And a reminder that the questions that we take during the meeting tonight will be considered by the agencies as they draft the ATMP, but they're not considered formal comments. The formal comments need to be submitted through the PEPC site or sent to the mailing address you'll see on the slide. As noted earlier, this meeting will be 90 minutes long and will adjourn at it's 5 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. And in the event that questions are addressed before this end time, we'll continue to hold the meeting for a while to allow for any additional questions to come in after you've had a chance to think about what you've heard in the presentations or maybe responses to some of the questions that you've heard come in. Okay. And with that, we'll go ahead and turn over to the Q&A session. It looks like we have had several questions come in. And hopefully we'll have good luck with video here. This first question, I'm going to introduce a new speaker, Vicki Ward with the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division of the National Park Service. We'll see if she wants to come on and go ahead and take this question. Vicki, are you? Yeah, okay, great, awesome. Okay, so Vicki, the question is, why are you trying to introduce air tours to the park?
Well, as mentioned during the presentation, commercial air tours already fly over Glacier National Park, and they have been for over 20 years. So it's not a new program. However, we are putting into place a air tour management plan that would include the routes, altitudes, and other operating parameters. So currently, as we mentioned, there's 3 commercial air tour operators currently authorized to fly, total of 891 air tours per year over the park using interim operating authority. And that interim operating authority does not set routes or operating conditions except to limit that number of air tours the operator is permitted to fly each year. On average, from 2017 to 2019, the 3 operators flew 144 commercial air tours per year over Glacier, and this is the number of annual tours being proposed in the draft ATMP, which is a reduction from the current maximum allowed. So the draft ATMP was presented earlier by Pete. That includes conditions designed to protect natural and cultural resources and visitor experiences. So there's routes being specified, altitude, the aircraft type, daytime restrictions, and restrictions for particular events. So until that air tour management goes into effect, none of these conditions currently exist. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Vicki. And this next question will pass over to Keith with FAA. The question is, what flights does this plan apply to?
Okay, thanks, Michelle. I know I touched a little bit on this on one of my early slides in the presentation regarding the Act and what it applies to. As mentioned, focus here is strictly on commercial air tour operations. The plan does not cover or put any requirements on general aviation activity, military activity, or commercial airline scheduled flight, those types of activities. The Act, well, when the FAA stood up the regulation for the Act, it was codified in CFR 14 Part 136. And it defines a commercial air tour operation as a flight conducted for compensation or hire in a powered aircraft for purposes of sightseeing over a national park or within a half-mile boundary of the park. And as I mentioned previously, it also defined that the airspace within which those commercial air tour operations occur, which is essentially flying over the park, within the park boundary, within a half-mile of the park boundary, and from zero, or basically ground level, to 5,000 feet AGL, above ground level. So hopefully that answers the question. Back to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Keith. Okay, this next question will be for Vicki. Why does the NPS and the FAA feel that a CE would that a CE would comply with the NEPATMA's environmental determination requirement?
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks for that question. As Keith mentioned during the presentation, a NEPA analysis has been conducted, and we are considering using an NPS categorical exclusion, which is 3.3A1, which is from the NPS National Environmental Policy Handbook that allows changes or amendments to an approved action, which in this case is the interim operating authority issued by FAA, and when such changes would cause no or only minimal environmental impact. We are completing an analysis of effects consistent with NEPA. The type of documentation that is most appropriate to the analysis will be informed by the feedback we received during the public review period on the draft air tour management plan to identify if additional effects not yet identified and analyzed exist, and whether or not there's the potential for adverse impacts that would make a different NEPA pathway more appropriate, such as an environmental assessment instead of a documented categorical exclusion. The FAA and NPS will consider public comments on the ATMP, information obtained during the consultations, and fully assess the environmental impacts before making a final determination on what NEPA pathway is appropriate. And as a reminder that a categorical exclusion doesn't mean that it's not excluded from NEPA. It means it's excluded from preparing an environmental impact statement. And if you have any comments on the appropriate NEPA pathway, please provide those through Pepsi. Hope that answers the question, and thanks, Michelle.
Yep, thank you, Vicki. So for the next question, we'll go ahead and introduce another new face from the park. I'd like to introduce Mary Riddle, the Chief of Planning and Environmental Compliance for Glacier. And Mary, the question is, in order to meet Glacier's 1999 General Management Plan, air tours need to be phased out. Will the final ATMP include a phase out date or a final date for air tours to be allowed?
The draft air tour management plan does not include a phase out date or final date for air tours. But as stated in the park's general management plan and many subsequent planning efforts, natural sounds and visitor enjoyment are conserved by addressing noise issues, including working with FAA to phase out commercial air tours through attrition, which has been and remains a priority management objective for the park. This draft air tour management plan includes a provision that no new entrants can be granted authorization to fly over the park, and that as the existing air tour companies sell or cease operating, their authority to operate over Glacier will also cease. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Mary. Okay, we have another question here that we'll send over to Adam. And the individual citing a specific place in the draft on page 10 of the Glacier ATMP under section 6, new entrants. It says that no new entrants will be considered and that it will not authorize commercial air tours by a successor in interest to any of the operators identified in table 1, by purchase, merger, or otherwise. And so they're asking, what is the definition of or otherwise in this instance, and how will FAA and the National Park Service ensure that attrition actually happens?
Thank you, Michelle. Generally, if an air tour company is sold and bought in whole, the new owners will be able to continue to conduct air tours through the IOA of the company or through the allocations allocated through this ATMP. However, for Glacier National Park, because the intent is to phase out air tours, if or when a company transfers this ownership, the authority to conduct air tours through this ATMP will not transfer. And so whenever an air tour company is bought or sold, they have something called op specs, and those have to be transferred to the FAA. And so it's through that process at which we will ensure that that happens. Michelle?
Thanks, Adam. Okay, this is great. We have a lot of good questions coming in. Let's send this next one over to Keith. The question is why did the NPS and the FAA choose not to include alternatives in the draft ATMP?
Well, I mean, we thought we had a fairly good plan going out and wanted people to take a look at it and review it and comment on it. You know, what's in place now without a final ATMP in place is, as has been discussed previously, just the interim operating authority conditions, which is a not to exceed number for those 3 commercial air tour operators under this plan. We're reducing it from the IOA numbers to more recent 3-year average down to 144 annual operations, but with a lot of additional provisions that the park included to protect park resources, including flying specified routes at higher altitudes, time of day restrictions, and caps on the daily number of tours and restrictions for particular events. So we thought we have a good plan here. Certainly, we're looking for comments from the public. Submit your comments if you think there's changes to be made or suggested improvements to this plan, or you have a whole different plan you would like to propose. We would certainly consider that and review that if you want to submit your comments through the Pepsi website. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Keith. All right, we'll ask Adam to come back on for the next question. Why does the ATMP allow flights over recommended wilderness in the park? It seems like approved flight paths should avoid recommended wilderness or not be allowed at all.
Thanks, Michelle. So the proposed ATMP limits the number of annual flights and limits the routes and the distance of those routes over wilderness, and it also includes minimum altitudes. So additionally, under this draft ATMP, flights would be limited to no more than 3 per day per operator. So currently, the minimum route altitudes are only recommended by the FAA and are not required, and operators are not restricted to specific routes. So under this plan, both the altitudes and the route conditions would be required, which would improve the conditions over wilderness. These measures are intended to protect wilderness and the visitor experience by limiting the number of potential disturbances caused by commercial air tours, and also provide opportunities for solitude and remoteness from the sights and sounds in wilderness or recommended wilderness. And also it would reduce the intensity of the air tour noise at the ground. So additionally, the hours of operation in the ATMP would provide for quiet periods around sunrise and sunset, which is the time when visitors can experience natural sounds, and also preserves the opportunities for solitude. But again, we encourage anyone who would like to see changes made to this draft ATMP submit their comments to Pepsi. Thanks, Michelle.
Great, thanks, Adam. Let's see. Keith, I'm actually going to come over to you now for the next question. It looks like this question here is, what is the status of the discussions with the Blackfeet tribe? Since there is no proposed route over the Blackfeet Reservation, what provisions have, I'm sorry if I got a little bit stuck here. what provisions have been made to recognize the traditional, culturally, historically important tribal areas within Glacier National Park?
So all tribes that attach religious or cultural significance to lands within the park have been invited to participate in consultations under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. That's one of the special purpose laws that I went over earlier on one of my slides. Agencies were going to consider tribal concerns in the development of the air tour management plans. We encourage tribal members to review the ATMP and submit any comments or concerns they may have. On February 2nd, we sent informal consultation letters to the Blackfeet Nation and Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. On March 26th, letters went out to 6 federally recognized tribes requesting their participation as consulting parties, as well as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Blackfeet Nation and the Montana State Historic Preservation Office. Next steps as part of that 106 process will be to reach out via email and other appropriate methods to all tribes that we have not heard from. Again, the consultation is ongoing. We will not finalize the air tour management plan until we have concluded those consultations. Many of the conditions in the ATMP are meant to improve the experience for all who visit Glacier National Park. Additionally, the air tour management plan includes provisions to restrict air tours for specific events or days, including requests from tribes for specific events or ceremonies. So hopefully that's responsive to the question.
Great, thanks, Keith. So it looks like we still have a couple questions coming in. I'm going to give folks a second to be able to get stuff typed in, get them to come through the internet here, and I'll be back on in just a second as the new questions come in. So stay tuned, we'll be right back. Okay, and to continue to thank you guys, the questions keep rolling in. So for this next one, we'll send it over to Vicki. And the question is, why has the, excuse me, let me clear my, excuse me. So the question is, why has the impact analysis not been shared with the public since it's being used to justify the use of a CE?
Oh, thanks, Michelle. As we noted, we are considering using a CE, and our impact analysis is draft at this point. And so once we get all the comments in, conclude with consultation, and if, depending on what final decision is made, if the final decision is made to use an NPS CE, we will make that CE document publicly available. when the final air tour management plan is published. Thanks. Back to you, Michelle.
For our next question, we'll introduce another new face from the park, Mark Beal, the Natural Resources Program Manager. So Mark, the question is, at what level AGL do studies show air tour, whether it's fixed or rotor, impacts to wildlife are non-existent?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It varies by species, but what this air tour management plan includes is provisions to protect all wildlife, including bald eagles and golden eagles, especially around the nests, along with other nesting raptors, and along with grizzly bears in their habitat. So the provisions in the air tour management plan are based upon national and regional guidance that we've received and have been published by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other agencies.
Great, thanks for coming on, Mark, and being here to support us with the questions. Okay, now we'll go back over to Keith with FAA. The next question is the no new applicants and no transfer unique to Glacier?
Yes, so thank you for that question. As I believe it was Adam had shown a map previously as part of a slide showing the 23, 24 park units where the agencies are currently in the process of developing air tour management plans, Glacier obviously being one of those. We released 4 draft air tour management plans in August last month for Mount Rainier, Olympic, Death Valley, and Everglades. And we're releasing 7 this month. So we're not through developing draft air tour management at all the parks yet. So it'd be premature for us to comment on whether this provision for the no transfer clause is going to be unique or specific to Glacier. I would say so far it is of the few parks that we've put drafts out. But again, things could change from a draft to a final, but also we still have to develop draft air tour management plans at a number of the parks yet. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Keith. So Vicki, this one's for you. Will the air tours be required to pay fees to fly in the park airspace? And if so, how much will they pay? And if not, why?
Well, the NPS is authorized to collect air tour fees by the Omnibus Reconciliation Act of 1993. And that authorized NPS to collect air tour fees that were happening in the airspace over certain parks. So currently the NPS collects fees for air tours over Grand Canyon National Park, Haleakala National Park, and Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. No other parks are authorized to collect air tour fees, and that is not part of the air tour management plan. And so fees are therefore not collected currently for over Glacier National Park. Hope that answers the question, and back to you, Michelle.
Great, thanks, Vicki. Next question, we'll send it over to Adam. The question is, what are the LMAX? What is the LMAX beneath from the Red Eagle operator aircraft on that tour loop?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. So for those who may not be aware what LMAX is, it's the maximum sound pressure level that may be associated with the air tour. Just like this person is asking about. And so maximum sound pressure level associated with air tours depend on many factors, including the type of aircraft, specific location, weather conditions, terrain conditions, etc. And so it's really difficult for us to speak to any LMAX without providing the appropriate context for that. Additionally, the Park Service and the FAA for these air tour management plans are looking at numerous metrics. So LMAX is something that we're considering, but so are many other metrics as well. Thank you.
Okay, and we have one more question here. We'll send it over to Keith. And it's a question about a specific operator, it seems like. They're asking, why is Homestead Aviation allowed to fly on either flight path?
Yeah, we can answer that. So basically, we reached out to the air tour operators early in the development process for Glacier, as well as all the other parks, to get additional information. We've been receiving reporting information from these operators for 6 or 7 years. They're required to report on the number of tours they do each and every quarter. But part of the information that we still needed from them was in regards to where they flew. So actually the routes of the tours that they did over the parks, as well as the altitudes. The short answer is, when we reached out to the operators for Glacier, Homestead helicopters did not provide us with any of that information. So the other 2 operators that are included in this air tour management plan, Red Eagle and Minuteman, did provide route information. We were fine with those 2 routes, and we just said that Homestead could fly on either of the routes. They really only have a handful of tours that they're allowed to do annually under this draft air tour management plan anyways. Back to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Keith. Excuse me. The next question is for Adam. And the question is, will the air tour pilot be able to deviate from the route for weather, wind, or other factors?
Thanks, Michelle. So except in an emergency, in an emergency situation or to avoid unsafe conditions, the operator will be able to allow to deviate. So the way the ATMP reads is that, except in an emergency or to avoid unsafe conditions, or unless otherwise authorized for a specific purpose, operators may not deviate from these routes and altitudes. So in short, yes, if there are weather or other factors the operator needs for safety of the aircraft and the people on the aircraft, they will be allowed to deviate.
Great. Thanks, Adam. And for let's see, for this next question, we'll go back to Mark at the park. The question is, or the commenter states that I see 2 Bear, SAR, and Alert traveling quite often to Glacier. Have you seen any wildlife or environmental impacts from these emergency operations, which often require hovering or loitering in place?
Yeah, so for 2 Bear and Alert, they're in the park responding to emergency situations, and at that time the staff on the ground are focused on the situation that's occurring and their safety as well as everyone else's that's involved in it. We have not had any reports of any impacts to wildlife, but in those situations where it's an emergency response, that's not what we're focused on at that point in time. So thank you.
Okay, looks like we have questions still slowly trickling in. So we're gonna give folks like a couple of minutes just to continue typing your questions in. And as soon as we get them over here on our end. We'll come back on to provide you answers. Thank you guys for hanging on still. And we're here and we want to hear from you. So please keep your questions coming in. We'll talk to you here in a minute. Okay, great. We got a couple more questions now. We'll go first to Keith. The question is asking if we have a rough estimate of how many general aviation Part 91 operations take place over Glacier.
We do not have any information that I'm aware of how many Part 91 general aviation operations would or have occurred over the park during any time frame that I'm aware of. So we just really don't have that information, and it's beyond the scope of this air tour management plan anyways.
Okay, thanks, Keith. And now, Adam, the question is when is the 5,000 foot altitude requirement in action? If an aircraft is flying over a low elevation lake and then passes over an 8,000 foot mountain, where are the aircraft supposed to be, and how can FAA enforce that?
Great question, Michelle. Thank you. So the altitude requirements in the ATNP are defined as any point under the aircraft or within 2,000 lateral feet. The draft ATNP also requires operators to equip with aircraft tracking technology and to report this information with their reported flight data. So that's how we define those altitude requirements, and that's how we'll be able to enforce those requirements. Thanks, Michelle.
Okay. And Keith, looks like we have a follow-up question here that we'll go over to you for. It's regarding the route flown by the Homestead helicopters. Their question is about their routes. Like, so is it because they didn't submit you any information, or because they didn't submit any information, they get to do whatever they choose, I guess is the question.
Well, it's not that they get to do whatever they choose. If they got to do whatever they chose, we would have said they could fly anywhere for the 4 or 5 tours that they're given annually. We put them on a specific route, one of 2 specific routes. These were routes flown by the other operators. Again, those routes, after reviewing those with the Park Service and our Flight Standards District Office, we really didn't have concerns with either of those routes. So we put Homestead for, again, I'm not sure that the total number of flights that they get, but I think it's less than 5 annually. We put them on 1 or 2. I see Adam.
It's 3.
They get 3. Thank you, Adam. So we put them on one of the 2 defined routes that the agencies were comfortable with. Thank you.
Adam and Keith, thank you for that. So we're coming up, got about 11-ish minutes left, and looks like we may still have another couple of questions coming in. So we'll give it another couple. For those of you that are out there still, we're still here. So please continue submitting your questions. We'll probably keep them for like another 5 minutes before we need to close out. So we will be here and we'll be back on here in just a moment. Okay, we have another question here, and we'll send this over to Keith. They're asking, would intergenerational transfer allow a company to continue to operate?
That would really depend on a number of factors and how that was structured, the details and specifics of which are really beyond my knowledge that would really require legal review. So we're really unable to provide a definitive response on that at the meeting here tonight. It would be something, again, our folks in legal would have to review, and as to the specifics of really how that was structured. So can't really answer that one tonight. Sorry.
Okay, and it looks like we have one last question here. Adam, oh, there you are. You're already on. You're ready to go. Read my mind. The question is, will the flight tracking data be monitored? And if so, by who?
Thanks, Michelle. So the flight tracking data, like the reporting data that is submitted by the operators currently, as well as we'll have to continue under this draft ATMP, will be analyzed, but it will be analyzed by both the NPS and the FAA. Thanks, Michelle.
Okay, so it looks like we are at the end of our time here. If there's folks of you that are if there's folks of you that are on the phone or are listening and can't see the screen, if you want to grab a pen and paper, I'm going to give you we're going to give you an email address here that you can write down if you had questions that we didn't get to. I think we were able to get to all the questions, but just in case, we want to provide that. So grab a pen. And in the meantime, before I close this out, I'd like to turn it over to Superintendent Webster for some final closing remarks.
All right, thank you, Michelle. Yeah, and especially thank you, Adam and Keith and Vicki, for helping with all of this effort over the last several months. And again, thank you to my staff for jumping on and answering questions for you all. Hopefully the answers were what you were hoping to hear. They answered your questions as you were intending to ask them. But again, if that wasn't the case, or we didn't get to questions, again, follow Michelle's link to follow up. And I do need to reinforce that the official comments go to the Pepsi site on the website address that's on the screen now. All of the Facebook comments and all of the other comments and other platforms help inform us overall, but we really need the official comments for this ATMP. And I would say that again, I'm with Keith that I think between the Federal Aviation Administration and the National Park Service, we've tried to craft an air tour management plan that meets our management objectives as best as possible across both agencies. Ours for Glacier National Park has a plan over time to get to where our objectives face, but certainly looking to the public to provide feedback as to where we are at with this plan, and definitely want to hear from all folks that have an interest in how air tours are managed over Glacier National Park. So thank you all again. Have a great evening, and look forward to seeing you in the park.
Thank you, Pete. So Mary Riddle, we heard from her earlier. She's going to be the point of contact for any follow-up questions. And if FAA can drop her email address into the chat, that would be wonderful. For those of you listening, her email address, it's Mary_Riddle@nps.gov. So it's MARY_RIDDLE@nps.gov. So again, that address is just for clarifying questions. If we didn't get to something that you thought about after the meeting that you'd like to ask, and all of the official comments, as we reiterate so many times, go through the Parks Pepsi page. I also wanted to make sure that we give it one more quick reminder that those comments need to be received on or before October 3rd. And overall, thanks to all of the presenters and thanks to you on the line for your participation. I'd like to say on behalf of both the FAA and the National Park Service, we look forward to hearing from you. We hope you guys have a good rest of your evening. Take care. Bye-bye.